Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii's Humane Architecture. This happening to be the 362nd episode, and on YouTube at least, we're somewhere in that Schnaps number of 22,222, somewhere there. So we're happy. If you have basically signing in to what you have been seeing in the announcement, which would have been virtuous, vulnerable Valencia, we got to ask for your patience for 2 more weeks because our brilliant guest Bilge is currently under the weather that she will explain to you then, and she couldn't make it. And then I scratched my head what to do instead, and I thought of someone else who has a similar head, and that's you, Jay Fidell. Happy to have you on this show.
Happy to be here.
Great, thank you. And we will talk about what we had planned to talk about next time after that. And everything happens for a reason, as they say, Jay. And so probably here the reason is that I told Bilge so that she can recover and feel better, that this saves her from going through a lot of pain on top of what she currently has, because this part then has been taken care of us already. And this has to do, Jay, with it's sort of like the architectural version of the great show or shows you did with DeSoto Brown actually last week. And this is the sad architectural version of that. And in fact, DeSoto had been part of preparing this show and doing emails back and forth. And it's about, I want to also give a reading recommendation, because ever since another president in the past that we don't have so fond feelings of it, although everything is relative, as that theory of relativity by Einstein, he created the 3 bad P's, P3, and that is the press and the professors are the problem. You know who that was already, Jay? That was Nixon, right? So we bad professors, that's one of my functions at the university. We are supposed to give reading assignments to our students. So to even younger students of life, there's a great German novel that we want to promote here, and that's called Das Trampeltier. And that's actually a name, a creature that existed before, way before Donald Trump showed up. It's about someone who is trampling down things and so forth. And you see up there in yellow what the publisher basically says the book is about. We also want to talk about an architect who, in all respect, bless him wherever he is, he passed away end of last year at upper age of 86, and his name is Robert A.M. Stern. And what you see here is not by Robert A.M. Stern, but his work gets pretty close to that, if that's fair to say, and that's arguable as everything. But this here is what probably we don't want to see, because again, this is like the embodiment of what you and DeSoto, Jay, have been talking about. This is the Trump ballroom that's currently under construction. In fairness, as the New York Times quote up there is that Stern has said he had not built anything with Trump, but actually Trump was knocking on his door and wanted to build with him. And I think that's kind of bad enough, because I wouldn't have let anyone even close to my door like Trump. But that's, again, I guess we're all different. So now we go to Honolulu. Oh, we went one too fast here. So this is hot off the internet of various websites that announce, as DeSoto was correctly saying, these 2 high-rises by developer Howard Hughes. And they're crowning or topping off the Kakaako neighborhood that they have rubber stamped with capital concentration, quoting you, Jay, high buildings, mostly useless and meaningless, except for a lot of profit. But environmentally or socially, which are the big challenges of our lives, we, after really careful consideration and observation, and we did tons of shows, too many shows that we wish we wouldn't have to do, but we just came to the realization and conclusion that there really shouldn't be there. So this one here is really strange in many ways, and we have been, we had a pre-glimpse of that off the internet about, I think, a year ago, where there was only this one picture here, and we compared it to on the right. And we had spontaneously, Jay, basically given this show the working title "Emperors in Plural, Ole Clothing." And Bilge, who you will love, and everyone else, Jay, that's one of our things is actually start architecture closer to us than the facade, but actually what we wear. That's one of our things, and that's something that DeSoto and I had been, DeSoto had been interested in and have been doing, preparing material. And so now we finally found someone in Bilge who's equally excited about that. So we found this Torre Richard puffy jacket that has a print of tropical pattern, and that was the closest that we could depict what we thought would, what this would be. But now we see more what it actually is. And again, like Matt Noblet, our guest for many shows, a Danish Boston booster, who had kindly served, as we always drag our guests into becoming architectural critics, because we don't have any anymore. We don't have, you're a big fan of Goldberger in New York City. We had Kurt Sandburn. We don't have anyone. So we got to dink around here, and drag others in as to give us architectural critique again. So this looks rather kind of comfy and kind of cushy. And again, I wish we had our dear friend Ron Lindgren with us, who already spent 2 shows talking about classicism, because his boss and business partner, Edward Killingsworth, Ron said was a classicist, a fine modern classicist. And you see you and I down there about 6 years ago. That was the first Trump administration where we had to talk about cynical classicism arising in America, because at Trump's first term, he made a classicist style mandatory for federal buildings. And we found this absurd. And then if you want to know more about it, you got to go back to these shows. And then again, what is cultivated classicism, as we call it, Ron's work? The Halekulani is his finest piece. There's a lot of classicist elements in there, and it's beautiful classicism. So there's nothing wrong with classicism per se. But if certain bad regimes use that for their bad intentions, and me as the German speaking, we've been there, right? Under Hitler, we had Albert Speer, that was Hitler's architect. And which style did they choose? Neoclassicism. Go figure. So these are the renderings that Howard Hughes is throwing out here, and you see this, and then they're coming out of the bushes down there, and in their description, they credit Bertram Goodhue as one of their inspiration. So put that into context here, and I hope sometime soon, if you haven't gotten your copy yet of our architectural guide that DeSoto and Don Hibbert and Bill Chapman and I were writing, of course, the Honolulu Museum of Art is in it, and that is a Bertram Goodhue building, and it's a beautiful building. But it's a beautiful building, as Bilge would say. And by the way, Thomas Auer, our guest from last week, Thomas says Bilge is his boss, and he means that, and he's so right on, as you will all find out when we all meet her. And so what Bilge had assigned for our students was to investigate in courtyards as a theme that is 1,000 years old, has existed in all cultures, and if it's still viable and could help with a climate crisis and with hotter climates in particular. So Goodhue did that, right? He blessed us with a multitude of courtyards here. This is Helena's drawings that she contributed. Thank you, Helena, for all of these. And you see the dotted ones are all the courtyards. So Goodhue was an architect who thought about climate, because courtyards can, make spaces comfortable through cooling. And Goodhue also, my home away from home originally is Nebraska. I can still say that well. So this is back from my prairie days, where there's also a Goodhue building, that show quote with DeSoto and Ron at the bottom left. You see my old big bold Lincoln town car in front of the Lincoln, Nebraska state capitol. That is by Bertrand Goodhue as well. And there's that little courtyard logo in there. It is a courtyard building. It has 4 courtyards on that low part. And then that tower is rising out of it. And that tower, I found these online, and there's the links there. This was a steel skeleton, and it was basically then clad with stone. Many moons ago, bottom right, one of our guests on the show met De Boer. This was about his final thesis about 2 decades ago. This is how time flies by. And so Matt had investigated in the evolution of tall buildings in Lincoln, Nebraska, but for housing and not for business. And he took environment into account. Would he do it like that these days? Maybe not. But again, this just shows we don't get basically stuck in time, or we shouldn't, right? Basically, culture and architecture as its embodiment should evolve. So here we are back with, are we evolving? And the show that De Soto and I did for having been invited at the AIA for a Pechakucha thing at the architecture week, we did the show. And just as a reminder, maybe people have forgotten, Howard Hughes was this guy who ended up tragic and crazy and nuts, and the Mormons then, grabbed him and took his money. But obviously enough was left to make this foundation that now, or corporation that Howard Hughes, is basically financed by. But before the guy went nuts, he was a filmmaker. He made Hollywood movies, and he built the biggest plane in the world, and he flew it himself. So this guy wasn't nuts to begin with. He ended up being nuts, unfortunately. But I don't think you want to refer to his nuts ending, right, with your corporation, which I think they're doing, throwing this out. But you should go back to his innovative times that he had at the very beginning. So we've already been talking about, and this is what, interestingly, when you were De Soto and you were talking about the New Deal, in the 30s in the United States, and this probably Rockefeller Center is one of the strongest, starkest embodiments of that, right? The New Deal, getting things back together and being proud and building these buildings, and but so obviously there's a stylistic reference to that, but Rockefeller Center here has a civic. You're a biggest fan that I know in the world, Jay, about public space and its power. So this is everyone knows the images of ice skating in front of Rockefeller Center around Christmas. Everyone knows that. I would be really surprised, and hopefully we will see that here. I mean, not ice skating, because that's maybe, off climatically, but something else that has that civic power, that is not just for the private residents, which unfortunately everything else, except a couple of overpriced kind of glitzy restaurants at the basis of the building. And, we in Germany, again, we had this, this is a show quote from, again, many shows ago when we were talking about Chicago, because most of the high rises in Kakaako, as we found out rather late, are by a firm out of Chicago, Solomon Courtwell Buens, and they were kind of sneaking in to our city of Honolulu. And so we were comparing it to Chicago, and it reminded me of Berlin after reunification at the Potsdamer Platz, which was, built with these 3 high-rises, one by Helmut Jahn, God bless him, because he got run over by 2 cars in the outskirts of Chicago, also age 80. And then we had Renzo Piano build one on the left, and we had Hans Kolloff, a German architect, basically who started out modern, but then he got frustrated and depressed, architecturally, and then didn't know any better as to go back to America from the 30s and Art Deco and reintroduce that to Germany after the reunification which was already rather questionable. So also odd, in the show up there, we were finding out that actually Solomon Courtwell Buens, SBC, is currently converting the good old Chicago Tribune Tower in Chicago, that icon of that sort of hinge or fringe of classical architecture to modernism by Raymond Hood. They're converting this into housing, which is typologically a good thing, but it's high-end housing, right? And that's not what helping us. And this is what Howard Hughes is about. So now you have another architect going, not Solomon Courtland Buell's going back in time, but you have Robert Stern going. And this is how, it would supposedly look if you're a bird and you're flying at sunset towards the artificial mountains. And this looks rather mountain-esque, right? It looks rather strong and solid. So we can only imagine high-rises have to be out of a skeleton. They are, and then they're clad with things. So there it is. And they're not afraid of actually pointing out the context. And that reminds us of our show with Pedro, Jay, up there, show quoted top left, where the stupid development down your alley, Nuano Avenue, with these two high rises that also don't come across as too promising, they showed to the left that they're near Queen Emma Gardens by Yamasaki, which is one of our most beautiful buildings. Also here at the bottom left, ovaled in there, is the other Yamazaki building, which is 1315 Alamoana Boulevard, which we rightly so have in the book as one of the finest examples that was the first one standing there and is still the best because everything around it has not been living up to that. Go figure, right? You call this devolution or de-evolution, because this building, if you study that, if you analyze that, and maybe, with Bilge and with Thomas, we want to get the discussion off the kind of the stylistic argumentation. Let's argue scientifically. Let's say, you're in the building and you have no AC. Can you survive? In these glass high rises, you cannot. You get baked. You get microwaved. In this building, you can. In fact, as we wrote there, many or several of the tenants are from 3 years after you came to the island. So you saw this high rise going up, Jay. You're an eyewitness because he came in 65. This was built in 68. So several of the original people still live there, and they live without AC because the building was designed. So there is a minimum or a right amount of glass that you still have beautiful views and framed views, but the building is basically shading itself. And we're doubting here that is the same case here, although Thomas Auer is talking about window wall ratio, and you can say, well, there's less glass, but all things considered, we also have to take into account, circularity is like, how is a building made? What kind of gray energy is put and poured in there? Poured concrete. This is likely stone. Stern's buildings are out of stone. And so this stone we don't have on the island, right? We have gray rock, lava rock, so we don't have limestone. So that all needs to be shipped in. And when they did this for the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, in the 30s, that was okay. One really didn't know any better, but now one should actually know better. And so if one talks about style, I want to quote our dear friend Ron when the Halekulani has been remodeling his Waikiki Park hotel that he designed into the Halepuna, rebranded it. And his dear friend, who's now also unfortunately deceased, Ken Mazuma, I think was his name. And he gave him a tour and they took me along. Then Ron at the end, he thanked him and he said, "Thank you that you have touched it up so lightly." It feels very New Yorkan, he said, and then he said, "But aren't we in Hawaii?" And that's the point, right? The Halekulani is open. You smell the breeze, you feel the breeze, and this is hermeticized, and so is to be assumed the whole thing, except the few lanais it has. And then you see the other. How can you be so blind that you have the IBM building that luckily has been saved thanks to several Docomomo Hawaii founding board members, which is an example that shows how you can make a modern building, as for IBM, how can it be more modern as a company back then? But then Osipov, the architect, having, and this is 2 years. I'm so jealous of you, Jay, that you had been there in the epicenter of innovation in Honolulu, where Kurt Sandburn and DeSoto Brown, as young kids, have agreed there was no cooler place on earth to be in Honolulu, and you were there. By the time I came, sorry, not anymore. And even worse, during the time I had been there, all this shit has been put there, and I feel really bad about it that, I wasn't able to prevent that. So here is Mr. Stern looking up, and this is the first, things I grabbed from the internet when I was trying to update myself and what was going on. So island aesthetic, what's really island aesthetic about that is the nostalgia about buildings, old buildings, but not even the important parts of the buildings, as we were talking with Goodhue with the courtyards. So Bilge has been the fantastic representative for the Biennale in Venice that we've been doing a show about, with the entry installation that makes you sweat. It's really about, she makes you feel how miserable it is what we do before you go in, and you can see pretty pictures. So this is from the time, from postmodernism, from Robert A.M. Stern, who was exhibited here, where they had this sort of catwalk with, I put, if you haven't noticed, I put up there these sort of iterations of explanations of what we see. So this sort of fashion fetishization of fenestration. And so a little bit of doing justice on behalf of Thomas Auer, because when Stern passed away last year, we happened to hang out with Thomas and met Noblet and went for a couple drinks. And then Thomas was getting sentimental and said, well, I know Stern as the dean of Yale, which he was, and as much as the architecture also I can't care for. But as a dean and as a person, he was a very sociable person, and he brought us all together, and there were parties. So there's this part as well that I want to share on behalf of Thomas. Again, not saying, look at Thomas there when he was looking at the Howard Hughes. Anytime I have someone coming, we pretend we're wealthy, and want to buy some condos there, and then they let us into the showroom. I'm waiting for the point when they have figured out that it's always the same guy bringing different people who never buy anything. So Howard Hughes is listening here, so they won't let us in anymore. So this one, since I'm currently not there, I pulled this off the web, and it's, it doesn't make, the model doesn't look any better. And look at the plinth down there. That's really sad. That's what we will see, when we drive down Ala Moana Boulevard, prime oceanfront, drive. We see that. And when Thomas was there and we were cruising in the easy breezy Benz, when the attempt of Howard Hughes doing affordable was going up, and it took us a while, or him a while, because I've been on the island a while, that, thermally, the building, as unfinished as was, thermal comfort wise, it actually was, you could have moved in. Culturally, it's a different question, and obviously, code wise, not, but climatically, while where we're here in Munich, you can't. You freeze to death. You really can't. So wrapping this up and opening for discussion, Jay, and we always finish each show and each book on an optimistic note with the emerging generation that gives us hope. So we also do in the book, where we have two double pages where we declinate that we first have tried to do better high rises, but came to the conclusion maybe there is no such thing as a good high rise. And then we basically take the existing high rises, release them from all the crap, And then the loads we basically then free up for that, we create to weave realms and Babylonian gardens in between, which sounds nuts, but is not. There's many shows that try to make that case. And look at De Soto, looking very, very excited. And the video in that show, you hear him screaming like I've never heard him screaming out of excitement, because there was some dry ice going on, and it was simulating the easy breeziness. And as Thomas also says, architecture was always breathing, and it should breathe again. So all these things considered, Jay, okay, is this going to happen anytime soon? Likely not, right? Not probably in a while, as much as we wish for. So this is only the appetizer for when Bilge picks up from here, because this is has to do with what we're going to challenge the next generation of students that will be coming from Hawaii, thanks to the generosity of hospitality of Bilge and Thomas. Will spend this fall again with us in Munich at the Technical University of Munich. And together with the Technical University of Munich, TUM students, they will investigate for, again, in people and planet-friendly architecture. And again, what does it all have to do with us? You probably remember this building here. It's not existing like that anymore. It's on Kapiolani Boulevard. And you see what likely Kurt agreed, although was hard, but he said, you're likely right. The two pieces he wrote in Civil Beat about all the corruption of the help me, the Ritzy Glitzy Carlton hotel back there. So this gives everyone an idea from Honolulu where this is situated, but we won't go any further because that's for Bilge to lift up our spirit. And unfortunately, this is probably well, we can say there's still hope. One can still dream about these things here might become true. So let's leave it with that on the positive note, but Bilge will take it to another level of positivity. So, all right, Jay. So how sad is that again? That, as bad as Kakaako already is, I think these are two last nails in this coffin of Kakaako. That's kind of bad acronyms, right? Coffin of Kakaako.
Couple of thoughts, Martin.
Please.
The one building that you've shown here today is the Halekulani that really appeals to me on the level that it is local. It feels local. It's whatever the design is consistent with, Hawaii. But most of the other ones we've looked at here today, and which exist all around the city, are not local. And Howard Hughes is not local. I remember, and this is so inconsistent, you talked about the Osipov IBM building, which is a very interesting, curious building, a lot of innovation there. And that's where the Howard Hughes headquarters is. And I went there with one of the other officers of ThinkTech one time, and we wanted to see what was coming up in Kakaako. This is before Howard Hughes built all those high rises in Kakaako. And they were there was a kind of a showroom of models, scale models of all these buildings they had in mind. And what was very interesting and troublesome about this is that it was loaded with Hawaiian words. Every building had a Hawaiian name, and there were all these Hawaiian slogans. And, most people, even local people, didn't understand what those words meant. But here we go. You hire somebody to write you a Hawaiian slogan, and now you've got a very un-Hawaiian building with a Hawaiian slogan. It was troubling. And you could tell that these buildings were not built for anybody in Hawaii. They were built for somebody who, had very deep pockets and came from very far away. And I remember, they showed us a model apartment, which was not built. It was still in the IBM building as a model. And the price on it was $110 million. $110 million. I later found out from a friend of mine in escrow that it sold at 95 million. And it's a deep breathing. I mean, how many local people could afford any fraction of that? So what happened, what it represented was we are building for people with deep pockets from very far away. And that is really sad because they don't live there. If you have that much money, you don't even rent it. You leave it empty. And so with a housing shortage, as you have talked about many times, you build apartments that can't really be occupied by local people and that aren't occupied at all because the absentee owners don't stay there very much. So in a way, it's been stolen from the Hawaiian people, the local people, by virtue of this development process.
Yeah, and on top of let me react to that, because when you see Thomas there, this is the model, or a later version, they kept updating that model. This is the model you were talking about. This is the showroom of Howard Hughes that was sneaking in Thomas, and he looks very suspicious there. But the ones he's standing close to are actually the affordable ones, right? So then Howard Hughes, was told, or maybe, got it, and said, okay, we can't just do high end. That's where we make the most profit. So we got to do something for the people. But I have to say that I find these probably even worse because, and the one that he stands very close to, which is the one that we did a show about, that we said, is the Miami Vice wannabe one, because, old fogies like us remember the original Miami Vice with Don Johnson. And in the opening scene, there was a helicopter flying by a building. And that was a building by architects who has also been trying to build something either for Howard Hughes or for, which we should also say, is Kamehameha Schools, who aren't doing any better, by the way. And that building was shown again in the opening scene, and that is dating back to the 80s. And our dear friend Ron Lindgren was once sitting in the Starbucks that's not there anymore, that was in Kakaako, looking at that building recently finished, and he said, spot on. He said, well, Architectonica's building, which had also it was an international style box building that they cut a square hole into. But and at least there was a palm tree in there, and there was a spiral staircase and a jacuzzi. And then here Howard Hughes was doing a bad mock-off of that decades later, way worse. And then Ron said, spot on, as he always was. He said, Architectonica's was a joke, and a good joke. And he pointed out this one, and there is a picture of him pointing in one of the many shows. And he said, this is a bad joke. And I think that's what I find cynical, is like that. I think the two towers for the little people, which are basically prisons, prison cells with not like as spacious as the high-end ones, where at least for your multi-million dollars, you get wide open space, right? And you get, German kitchen appliance and all these, gadgets. For whom? And of course it's wrong, right? But I think I find it even worse that for the people who try to make it, and scramble all their money, and then they get caged in and put in these prison cells with a single wall AC unit there. I find that even worse, I have to say. And that's, I think, what Kamehameha School, also with Stanford Carr, predominantly is doing. Well, and you can't really, maybe I should say they're both just as bad in their different ways, right? And altogether, they're really wrong. And when you always say in a depressing moment, rightly so, which you're allowed to have, Jay, and you say, well, we're stuck with these for decades, if not centuries, because that's how long concrete is lasting. And that's, I think, I did this for you to get you out of your depression, because you can all unskin them. You can all undress them. And then there are already better buildings. And, wind protection, I think you're having another storm, if I'm not mistaken, as we're speaking, right? And you had one 2 weeks ago. So there's lots of storms. But there's many shows you can make, a storm protection and shutters out of different materials in different ways, as indigenous architecture has always been doing. You don't need to make it out of glass. So if anything, I think this super, and we also, I think I should bring back, your dear friend and my dear friend, our dear friend George Kaysen, we've actually been talking about because you had the great movie show. And I want to do one with you guys about Avatar, the new Avatar. And maybe we should then give it to Cameron and say, hey, James, you've been doing these. They're greatly animated, but they're fictional. Don't you want to do this in real? Because he promised, like, he wants to dedicate the rest of his life to the Avatar sequel, right? Sequence. So maybe we drag him and we say, because he's been saying he's bringing his crew to Kauai, I think, and mostly when people fly to another island, they come through Honolulu to immerse them into the good world. But he might have been driving through Kakaako, and that might have been depressingly inspiring for what he depicts the Bridgehead City, which is this imperialist creation of destroying everything, right? So how about basically you convert, it back? And it's obviously, I see your smile on your face, and this is like, okay, maybe Martin needs to see the doctor if he really seriously thinks this is ever going to happen or anytime soon. But come on, James Cameron, we can just kick him with that and saying, hey, James, just a thought, you gave us this idea, well, there were other ideas behind, but he fits right in. But anyways, that's like we're getting close to we maybe got a couple more minutes, hopefully, because he had another point. So do you still remember that one? The other?
Oh, I have more than one, but let me let me just go to one. You talk about the useful life of these buildings, and I believe it's hundreds of years. It's beyond our lifetimes for sure. And you talk about the possibility of taking the skin off and redeveloping it, from the outside, perhaps. That's not likely to happen because people have invested millions, tens of millions, in some cases, hundreds of millions in these condos. They're not about to give it up. Back in the day when there was leasehold being sold in Honolulu, the lease would come to an end, and then theoretically the building would be demolished, a la what happens in Singapore, which is a good thing. But these buildings are never going to be demolished because they're fee simple, and there's no easy legal relief to take them down and fix them up. That's just not going to happen. Not until we change the law, but that would be, a condemnation issue, and it would be, a tough legal issue. So I think they're going to stay there for a while, however bad they are. So then that's one factor. The other factor is that what we have here is a shortage of land in an island. Part of that is that the state itself is the largest landowner in the islands. Most of the lands in Hawaii are owned by the state, and they're very tough about giving it away or selling it. So the result is the amount of land that's available for residential or for any, human purpose or humane purpose, as you like, is limited. And so what happens in a supply-demand market? It has to make a profit because you're paid too much for the land. The cost of occupancy is too high. And the result is that you get travesties, and you have to keep the travesties. And the other part of it is a company like Howard Hughes or Kamehameha Schools are under an obligation, whether it's real or perceived, to make a profit on everything. So they are always trying to squeeze for a profit. And the result is they are, selling to people who are capable of buying extravagant units, condo units. And there's no real, may I say, larger plan, because the Department of Planning and Permitting doesn't really care how the larger picture comes out. And I don't know how you feel as an architect, but I admire the University of Virginia, where there is some consistency in red brick buildings. They're different shapes and sizes, but they're all red brick buildings. And I don't think there's any consistency among these buildings that have gone up. And so I don't think there's real planning going on. And I'm sorry, as you are, that the AIA has not been able to limit the capital concentrations or the Department of Planning and Permitting. And we are saddled with this. And in many ways, it has stolen our local soul.
Let me respond in a way that we're still, not still, increasingly cutting close to having to wrap up, but on a positive note, also thinking of someone that we both remember well because you had her on several shows, and she used to be our faculty Friday afternoon yoga teacher, and that's Sai, sweet Sai from India. You remember her. There's a couple of great shows you did with her. So Sai, I miss you and I miss your yoga. And the way she did yoga was not like top down, like saying, okay, I'm the master, although she grew up with it, right? So she is. But she says, I'm just doing this for me, and you guys can join or not. And I'm doing this because I'm a catastrophist. She called herself a catastrophist. And she says, all I'm doing is basically trying to cope with that. And that's why I'm doing yoga. And I invite you to do that, right? So I'm saying catastrophizing, sometimes it needs, things to shake things up. So if things keep going like that, and money pours in and supply chain is assured, but these things are not a given anymore, right? I mean, everything that you dedicate the streamline of ThinkTech Kawaii shows are addressing, nothing is we can't take for granted anymore. Socially not, environmentally not. We have been spared from that one hurricane that other islands had, right? Let that finally come and hit us. These buildings will be nakeded, not by Martin's weird dreams, but by the full forces of nature. We know all these pictures that glass shatters and is basically blown out. We have other scenarios. We were just talking, there's tariffs, stupid Trump tariffs, right? And it hits, Las Vegas is already hit, and his visitors are declining. So we know we're a monoculture economically on tourism. So let the catastrophe scenario of COVID repeat itself economically, right? So there's so many, and there's also you have so many people on the street. There is a certain point that history teaches us they will not stay quiet anymore. They will rise up, right? And they will take what they think they deserve, right? So supply chain, right, of food, right? If that hurricane hits, and we're off supply chains, we're off oil that pumps oil into these buildings and chills them. If you don't have these tankers coming anymore, might it be for environmental reasons, for that one big storm, or might it be that other economical storm coming, right? And these ships are not coming. You cannot live in these buildings anymore. So I think this is an interesting, and this is probably, not to be, this is food for thought, a lot food for thought, probably too much and very hard to digest. I'm very aware of that, but I leave us with that, right? That there is alarm signs left and right that all you guys on all your great shows always talk about. And just to say they're never going to affect us, they're never going to hit us, is really, really naive, to say the least, if not stupid.
We have miles to go before we reach the end of this discussion, Martin.
We will. And we will have, since I know I couldn't get you on this angle, and bummer, you're trained as a lawyer, so what can I say about your reservations about this coming to happen? And this is why we're happy to have Bilge, because Bilge is going to try with the students and us try to get you on another angle. So we're not giving up with propositions that are promising. So let's look forward to that. And thanks, Jay, for having been serving and willing to live through this misery here of this the two last coffins in Kakaako's Howard Hughes development. But we had to talk about it, and we will not stop talking about how one could do better. And that power is within the emerging generation that is gonna change the future for the better. We will not give up on believing in that. And on that promising note, thanks everyone. Thanks, Jay. And see you all in 2 weeks. Back then with Bilge. and amazing stuff. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, everyone.